There comes a moment in every major social shift where people stop arguing, stop negotiating, and stop hoping that things will somehow correct themselves. And instead, they quietly change direction. That moment is rarely loud, rarely dramatic, and almost never announced in advance. It shows up as silence, as absence, as people choosing not to participate anymore. What we are witnessing right now is one of those moments, and it involves men stepping away from systems, expectations, and relationships that no longer reward effort, honesty, or stability. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why this shift is not temporary, why it is accelerating, and why once faith is gone, it does not simply come back because someone asks for it. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every Angry Guy video the moment we release it. That small action helps the channel more than most people realize, and it ensures you do not miss future discussions like this one. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. The Academy is designed to teach you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, with a focus on long-term thinking and self-protection in an unstable financial world. The link is in the description of the video, so go check it out now and take control of your financial future. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the content flowing, and it is genuinely appreciated. Now let us talk about what is actually happening beneath the surface, because the headlines and social media arguments miss the point entirely. This is not about anger, revenge, or hostility. This is about exhaustion, clarity, and acceptance. Men are not leaving loudly. They are leaving quietly. They are not staging protests or demanding apologies. They are simply opting out. And the reason this matters is because faith, once lost, is not something that can be demanded back. Faith is built through consistent behavior over time, and it is destroyed the same way. For decades, men were told that they were the problem. They were told that their instincts were wrong, their boundaries were unacceptable, and their natural behaviors were something that needed to be corrected, restrained, or apologized for. They were told they needed to change, improve, listen more, speak less, and prove their worth continuously. At the same time, they were told that they were not needed, that independence meant separation, and that traditional cooperation between men and women was outdated or unnecessary. Men heard this message repeatedly, not once or twice, but over years and decades, reinforced by media, education, entertainment, and social norms. When people hear a message often enough, they eventually believe it, or at least they stop arguing with it. Men did not respond the way many expected. They did not fight harder to prove value to people who said they had none. They did not double down on systems that treated them as disposable. Instead, they adjusted. They internalized the message and asked a very simple question. If I am not needed, then why am I here? If my effort is assumed, my contribution minimized, and my risk ignored, then what exactly am I working toward? That question changes everything, because once a man begins to ask it honestly, the answers are uncomfortable but clarifying. Many realized that they were participating in arrangements where the costs were guaranteed and the rewards were conditional. They were expected to provide time, attention, resources, and emotional labor, while being told that expectations in return were unreasonable or outdated. They were encouraged to pursue relationships while simultaneously being warned that initiating, expressing interest, or setting boundaries could be interpreted negatively. Over time, the contradiction became impossible to ignore, so men adapted in the most logical way possible. They stopped engaging, they reduced exposure to risk, they focused inward, they simplified their lives, they stopped chasing approval from systems that had already decided what they were allowed to be. This was not an act of bitterness, it was an act of self-preservation. And the more men stepped back, the clearer their thinking became. One of the most important realizations many men reached was that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. That distinction is critical, and it is something that rarely gets discussed honestly. Loneliness is a state of emotional lack. Solitude is a state of chosen peace. Men discovered that when they removed constant tension, judgment, and performance from their lives, they did not collapse into despair. Instead, they experienced relief. Their stress levels dropped, their finances stabilized, their mental clarity improved. They slept better. They spent time on things that actually mattered to them. Minimalism became less of a trend and more of a natural outcome. Men realized they did not need much to be content. A stable routine, personal interests, financial autonomy, and quiet were often enough. When external chaos was removed, internal stability followed. Many men began investing in themselves in practical ways. Health, skills, hobbies, savings, and personal space took priority. There was no audience for this transformation, no applause, and no validation from outside. That is precisely why it lasted. At the same time, something else was happening. The systems that had relied on men's constant participation began to feel the absence. Dating markets shifted, social dynamics changed, financial expectations were no longer being met automatically. The unspoken assumption that the men would always show up, pay, pursue, and provide started to crack. And rather than asking why men had withdrawn, much of the response focused on demanding that they return. This is where the conversation often becomes emotional instead of analytical. Many reactions framed men's withdrawal as a problem to be fixed rather than a signal to be understood. But signals exist for a reason. When large numbers of people independently make the same choice without coordination, it is not a trend, it is feedback. And the feedback was clear. The cost benefit calculation no longer made sense. Men did not leave because they hate women. They left because they stopped trusting the structure of modern relationships and social expectations. Trust is built on predictability and fairness. When outcomes become uncertain and risks become asymmetrical, trust erodes. Once that erosion reaches a certain point, people stop investing. This is true in finance, business, and human relationships alike. What makes this moment different from previous cultural shifts is that it is happening quietly and permanently. There is no grand reconciliation coming. There is no collective apology that will suddenly restore faith. Men who have reorganized their lives around peace and autonomy are not waiting to be convinced otherwise. They have already tested the alternative and found it lacking. They are not angry, they are done. This is why you see increasing numbers of men choosing not to date, not to marry, and not to participate in social rituals that once defined adulthood. It is not fear, it is clarity. They have observed patterns over time and adjusted accordingly. Observable reality has replaced promises and narratives. When actions consistently produce negative outcomes, rational people stop repeating them. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men realized how transactional certain dynamics had become, even when they were presented as emotional or romantic. When effort is expected, but appreciation is optional, motivation fades. When accountability flows in only one direction, resentment builds. Rather than arguing endlessly about fairness, men simply opted out. Silence became the boundary. As the shift continues, you will see more attempts to shame, pressure, or guilt men back into participation. You will hear claims that something is wrong with them, that they are avoiding responsibility, or that they are missing out. But the men who have already left are not confused. They are not lost. They are not looking for permission. They are content. This is where storytelling matters because history shows us that societies often misinterpret withdrawal as weakness when in reality it is a form of strength. The ability to walk away from a bad deal without needing validation is one of the hardest skills to develop. It requires patience, discipline, and self respect. Once learned, it does not disappear easily. Men spent decades being told what they should want, who they should be, and how they should behave. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Now many are deciding for themselves. They are redefining success on their own terms. Quiet mornings, controlled expenses, personal projects, and freedom from constant judgment are becoming more valuable than status or approval. This is not collapse. It is recalibration. As economic pressure increases and social systems strain, the difference between those who conserved energy and those who relied on external support will become more visible. Men who stepped back early, simplified their lives, and focused on self reliance are finding that they are better positioned for uncertainty. They are not scrambling, they are not panicking, they are adapting. And this does not mean men are incapable of connection or cooperation. It means they are selective. It means they require consistency, mutual respect, and accountability. When those elements are absent, they no longer try to force compatibility. Walking away has become a rational choice rather than an emotional reaction. And this brings us to the core truth that many people are struggling to accept. Once faith is gone, it does not return through demands or criticism. It returns only through long term behavioral change, demonstrated consistently without expectation of immediate reward. Until that happens, the path men have chosen will continue, not as a movement, but as a personal decision repeated millions of times. To understand why this shift has become permanent rather than cyclical, you have to understand how men process experience differently once repetition replaces hope. Early on, many men believed that the tension they felt was temporary, that cultural moods would swing back, that mutual understanding would eventually be restored. They assumed that patience would be rewarded, but patience without progress eventually becomes resignation, and resignation eventually becomes disengagement. What changed was not a single event or moment, but the accumulation of small, consistent signals that all pointed in the same direction. Men began to notice that accountability had quietly vanished from many interactions. Expectations flowed toward them, while responsibility flowed away from others. If a relationship struggled, the assumption was that men needed to improve communication, effort, or emotional awareness. If systems failed, men were told to adapt, to learn, to absorb the impact. Rarely was there an equivalent expectation placed elsewhere. Over time, this imbalance stopped feeling like cooperation and started feeling like obligation. At the same time, public narratives increasingly framed men as either problems to be managed or utilities to be accessed. There was little room left for men to simply exist as individuals with their own limits, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Even attempts at self expression were often met with dismissal or suspicion. This created a quiet internal conflict. Men were told to open up, but when they did, those admissions were frequently minimized, reframed, or used against them later. The lesson was subtle but effective. Silence became safer than honesty. As this pattern repeated, many men reached a tipping point. They stopped trying to explain themselves. They stopped defending their intentions. They stopped engaging in debates that never led anywhere. Instead, they focused on what they could control: their time, their energy, their resources, their environment. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, decision by decision, boundary by boundary. One of the most significant changes occurred when men began to reassess the idea of success itself. For generations, success was defined externally: Career advancement, family formation, social approval, and public validation were presented as universal goals. But when the path toward those goals became increasingly uncertain and costly, men started asking whether those goals were still worth pursuing. For many, the answer was no, not in the form they were being offered. This reassessment led to a quieter life, but not an empty one. Men began to invest in personal mastery rather than public recognition. Skills that produced tangible results replaced pursuits that depended on approval. Practical knowledge became more valuable than social signaling. This shift brought a sense of grounded confidence that did not require constant reinforcement. Men learned to trust their own observations rather than external narratives. There is an important difference between isolation and independence, and it is one that often gets deliberately blurred. Isolation is imposed, independence is chosen. The men who stepped back did not disappear because they were pushed into corners. They stepped away because they realized they could build stable, satisfying lives without constant negotiation or conflict. They discovered that peace was not something granted by others, but something constructed through boundaries. Another element that accelerated this change was the growing unpredictability of social consequences. When rules are unclear and enforcement feels inconsistent, rational people reduce exposure. Men observed that actions which were once neutral or positive could now be interpreted negatively depending on context, perception, or mood. This uncertainty created a risk environment that discouraged participation. Rather than attempting to navigate an ever shifting landscape, many men chose to exit it entirely. This is where pattern recognition becomes central. Men did not need ideological alignment or online communities to reach similar conclusions. They observed outcomes. They compared notes quietly. They noticed that the men who reduced involvement often reported better mental health, improved finances, and lower stress. These were not theories, they were lived results. When reality reinforces a decision, that decision becomes durable. As men withdrew, something else emerged that few anticipated. Many discovered that they had more capacity than they realized. Without the constant drain of expectation, they had time to think, to plan, to recover. Creative projects resurfaced, physical health improved, sleep cycles normalized. The absence of chaos created space for growth. This reinforced the decision to stay disengaged from environments that reintroduced instability. It is important to understand that this withdrawal is not fueled by resentment. Resentment requires ongoing emotional investment. What we are seeing instead is detachment. Detachment is quieter and far more difficult to reverse. When someone stops arguing, stops persuading, and stops seeking validation, they have already moved on internally. That is the stage many men have reached. Attempts to re engage men often miss this distinction. Appeals are made through criticism, fear, or moral obligation. But obligation without reciprocity does not inspire participation, it accelerates withdrawal. The men who have stepped away are not waiting for permission to return, they are waiting for nothing. Their lives already function without the structures they left behind. This creates a cultural blind spot. Systems built on the assumption of male participation struggle when that participation becomes optional. Dating markets, economic expectations, and social rituals all rely on predictable behavior. When that predictability disappears, frustration grows. But frustration alone does not solve the underlying issue, it only highlights it. Men are not withholding participation as leverage, they are simply choosing differently. That distinction matters. Leverage implies negotiation. Choice implies finality. You cannot negotiate with someone who is content elsewhere. Contentment is a powerful stabilizer. Another factor that reinforced the shift was the increasing visibility of consequences. As men stepped back, they observed how quickly certain structures destabilized. They noticed rising dissatisfaction, increased demands, and growing anxiety from systems that had assumed their constant involvement. This observation did not produce guilt, it produced confirmation. It showed that their contributions had always mattered, even when they were told otherwise. For many men, this realization was bittersweet. It validated their decision to leave, but it also confirmed that honesty had been lacking for a long time. Being told that you are unnecessary, only to be asked to return when absence creates strain, does not rebuild trust. It weakens it further. Trust cannot be toggled on and off based on convenience. As men continued to adapt, they also became more selective in the relationships they did maintain. Friendships that were reciprocal, low conflict, and grounded in shared interests flourished. Surface level connections faded. Men began to value depth over breadth, fewer interactions, but more meaningful ones. This selectivity improved quality of life without increasing risk. Financial behavior changed as well. Men who once felt pressure to spend on appearances or social obligations began redirecting resources towards savings, investments, and long term security. Consumption decreased, ownership increased. This shift quietly altered economic patterns, though it has yet to be fully acknowledged. When large numbers of people reduce discretionary spending tied to social signaling, entire industries feel it. This is not a rebellion, it is an adjustment to incentives. People respond to incentives, not slogans. When incentives favor withdrawal over participation, withdrawal becomes the rational choice. Men are not trying to send a message, they are responding to conditions. As this pattern continues, narratives will attempt to pathologize disengagement. Labels will be applied, motives will be assigned, but labeling does not change behavior. It only reveals misunderstanding. The men who have stepped away are not confused, they have clarity. They know exactly why they made the choices they did. The most overlooked aspect of this shift is how calm it is. There is no chaos on the side of those who left. There is no outrage cycle, no endless commentary. There is quiet progress, quiet routines, quiet satisfaction. This calm is precisely what makes the shift difficult to reverse. Noise can be addressed, silence cannot. History shows us that when groups withdraw quietly, institutions struggle to respond effectively. They are designed to react to pressure, not absence. Absence does not negotiate, it does not argue, it simply persists. That persistence reshapes the landscape over time. Men walking away are not seeking to punish anyone, they are seeking alignment. Alignment between effort and outcome, alignment between values and behavior, alignment between risk and reward. When alignment is missing, participation ceases. As we continue, we will explore what this means for the future, not in abstract terms, but in practical ones. What happens when large numbers of men build lives that do not revolve around traditional expectations? What happens when cooperation becomes conditional rather than assumed? What happens when peace becomes more valuable than validation? These questions matter because they point toward a future that is already forming, not through declarations or movements, but through millions of individual decisions made quietly, consistently, and without drama. When you look at how societies respond to withdrawal, a consistent pattern emerges. The first reaction is denial. People insist nothing meaningful has changed and that participation will return to normal once emotions cool or trends shift. When denial fails, the second reaction is moral framing. Withdrawal is redefined as selfishness, immaturity, or avoidance of responsibility. This stage attempts to pressure people back into compliance by attacking character rather than addressing conditions. What is happening now is that many men have already passed through both stages internally. They are no longer debating whether their choice is justified. They are living the results of that choice and finding it sustainable. One of the most revealing aspects of this moment is how little persuasion actually matters once a man has reorganized his life around stability. Arguments that once might have triggered self doubt now fall flat. Emotional appeals lose power when they are disconnected from lived experience. If a man wakes up calm, works on what he chooses, manages his money responsibly, and ends his day without stress, no abstract claim about what he is supposedly missing carries much weight. Reality has already answered the question. This is why so many attempts to pull men back rely on urgency and fear rather than attraction. You hear claims that something is broken, that something is ending, that consequences are looming if men do not re engage. But fear only works when someone feels dependent. Independence dissolves fear. Once a man realizes that his well being is not contingent on constant participation in unstable systems, urgency sounds hollow. Another shift that deserves attention is how men are redefining companionship itself. Rather than pursuing roles, titles, or social scripts, many are prioritizing environments that are low conflict and mutually respectful. This applies to friendships, work relationships, and personal connections. The common thread is predictability. When expectations are clear and boundaries are honored, trust can exist. When ambiguity dominates, withdrawal follows. This preference for predictability has also reshaped how men approach time. Time is no longer treated as something to be spent, proving value. It is treated as a finite resource to be protected. Men are saying no more often, not out of hostility, but out of clarity. They understand that every yes carries opportunity cost. Saying yes to chaos means saying no to peace. Once that trade off becomes visible, the choice becomes easier. The broader culture often underestimates how deeply men value internal order. While public narratives focus on external success, many men quietly measure their lives by internal metrics: stress levels, sleep quality, focus, physical health. When participation in certain systems consistently degrades those metrics, men do not need ideology to justify leaving. They need results, and the results have been clear. This internal recalibration has led to another overlooked outcome. Men are becoming more resilient, not through struggle, but through reduction. Instead of constantly adding obligations, they are removing friction. This creates a form of strength that does not rely on constant exertion. It is sustainable, it compounds over time, and it is difficult to disrupt once established. As more men adopt this approach, you begin to see subtle but significant changes in social dynamics. Initiation decreases, pursuit declines, negotiation becomes optional rather than expected. This is not apathy, it is discernment. Men are no longer willing to invest energy into situations where outcomes are unclear or costs are asymmetric. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is how little anger is involved. Anger is loud and visible. It seeks reaction. Detachment is quiet and final. Many observers mistake silence for weakness because they are accustomed to conflict signaling importance. But silence often signals resolution. It means the internal debate is over. This resolution creates a gap between perception and reality. From the outside, it may look like men are disengaged, passive, or indifferent. From the inside, it feels like focus, alignment, and relief. That difference in perspective explains much of the confusion surrounding this topic. People assume dissatisfaction where there is contentment. They project distress where there is calm. As economic uncertainty increases globally, this calm becomes even more valuable. Men who simplified early are finding that they have lower overhead, fewer dependencies, and greater flexibility. They are not tied to outcomes they cannot control. This gives them an advantage in volatile conditions. Stability is no longer about growth at all costs, it is about survivability with dignity. Another important factor is how men are responding to constant scrutiny. When every action is subject to interpretation, many choose inaction, not because they lack courage, but because the risk to reward ratio no longer makes sense. This is a rational response to environments where consequences are unpredictable and forgiveness is scarce. People adapt to the rules they are given, not the rules they are told exist. Men have also become more attentive to consistency. Words mean less than patterns. Promises mean less than outcomes. This shift toward evidence based trust is one of the reasons reconciliation is so difficult. Trust, once broken, requires repeated proof over time, not statements or campaigns. And proof requires behavior change, not messaging. What complicates this further is that many systems benefit from the appearance of engagement even when substance is lacking. When men disengage authentically rather than performatively, it exposes gaps that cannot be filled with symbolism. This creates tension because symbolism is easier to deploy than structural reform. The cultural conversation often frames this as a loss of connection, a loss of community, a loss of shared purpose. But from another angle, it is a redistribution. Men are redirecting their energy toward areas that produce tangible returns: personal growth, financial security, physical health, creative pursuits. These are not empty substitutes, they are foundations. This redirection also changes how men perceive responsibility. Responsibility is no longer defined by obligation to others alone. It includes responsibility to oneself, preserving mental health, avoiding unnecessary risk, building sustainable routines. These responsibilities are taken seriously, even if they are invisible to the outside world. One of the most striking developments is how men are redefining maturity. Instead of equating maturity with sacrifice without limit, many now equate it with discernment, knowing when to engage and when to walk away. Knowing what is worth effort and what is not. This form of maturity does not announce itself. It is expressed through restraint. As restraint becomes more common, it challenges narratives that depend on constant male participation. This creates friction because narratives rarely adapt as quickly as behavior. The result is misalignment. Expectations remain, but participation declines. That gap generates confusion, frustration, and blame. Blame, however, does not restore alignment, it deepens the divide. Men who feel blamed for disengaging are even less likely to return, not out of defiance, but because blame confirms their original assessment. That assessment being that engagement comes with disproportionate cost. This is why solutions that focus on tone rather than structure fail. Asking men to feel differently without changing conditions is ineffective. Feelings follow experience, not the other way around. When experience improves, openness returns naturally. When it does not, withdrawal persists. Another overlooked dimension is how this shift affects younger men. They are watching, they are observing the outcomes of different choices in real time. Many are learning early that silence can be safer than participation, that independence can be preferable to entanglement. This learning happens without instruction. It happens through observation. As younger men internalize these lessons, the shift compounds. What began as a response among older men becomes a baseline assumption for younger ones. This generational layering makes reversal even less likely. Norms change when new behaviors are normalized, not when old ones are defended. This does not mean cooperation is impossible. It means it must be re-earned. Cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than obligation, respect rather than assumption, transparency rather than ambiguity. These conditions are not unreasonable, but they require effort from all sides, not just one. Men who have stepped away are not opposed to cooperation. They are opposed to imbalance. They are open to systems that reward contribution fairly and respect boundaries consistently. Until such systems exist, Disengagement remains the rational choice. As we move deeper into this discussion, it becomes clear that this is not a temporary phase. It is a structural adjustment. Men have recalibrated their expectations, and once expectations change, behavior follows. Reversing behavior without addressing expectations is futile. The question then becomes not how to bring men back, but how to adapt to a reality where participation is optional. That adaptation will require honesty, humility, and patience. It will require acknowledging that trust was damaged and cannot be restored overnight. It will require consistent behavior over time without guarantees of immediate return. Until then, the path many men are on will continue quietly, consistently, without announcement. They will build lives that make sense to them, regardless of whether those lives align with outdated expectations. When people finally move past denial and moral pressure, the next response is often bargaining. This is where language softens slightly, where phrases like compromise, balance, and understanding start to appear. On the surface, this seems constructive, but for many men, it arrives too late. Bargaining assumes that both sides still want the same thing and are merely negotiating terms. What men discovered during their withdrawal is that their desires had changed. They were no longer trying to win approval or negotiate space. They were trying to protect peace. Once peace becomes the priority, bargaining loses relevance. Peace is not dramatic. It does not announce itself or demand attention. It shows up as fewer conflicts, fewer obligations, and fewer explanations. Men who have found this state are reluctant to give it up for promises of improvement. Promises are easy, patterns are rare. This is why messaging campaigns and public conversations often feel disconnected from reality. They are built around words, not lived change. Another important layer to understand is how men adapted emotionally during this process. Emotional regulation did not come from external validation, it came from predictability. When men removed themselves from volatile environments, emotional stability followed naturally. This reinforced a critical insight. Emotional health does not always require more expression. Sometimes it requires fewer triggers. This insight runs counter to much of the advice men have received over the years. They were told to open up, to communicate more, to share feelings. But many discovered that openness without safety is not healing, it is exposure. Exposure without protection teaches restraint. Men learn to reserve vulnerability for environments that could handle it responsibly. Where that was not available, silence became the wiser choice. This does not mean men stopped feeling, it means they stopped offering access indiscriminately. Emotional economy became intentional. Energy was spent where it produced stability rather than conflict. Over time, the selective engagement reduced emotional fatigue and increased self trust. Self trust is one of the most powerful outcomes of this shift. When men rely less on external affirmation and more on internal assessment, they become harder to manipulate and easier to satisfy. They know what works for them, they know what does not. They stop outsourcing judgment. This independence is often misunderstood as detachment, but it is closer to alignment. As alignment increases, tolerance for chaos decreases. Men begin to recognize patterns early and disengage before escalation. This is not avoidance, it is efficiency. Just as people avoid investments with poor returns, men avoid interactions that consistently produce stress. The logic is simple, and it is difficult to argue against without ignoring outcomes. One of the more subtle consequences of this shift is how men relate to authority and institutions. When trust erodes at a personal level, it often extends outward. Men become less inclined to accept directives without explanation. They evaluate claims against experience. This does not make them oppositional, it makes them discerning. Discernment, once developed, does not switch off easily. This discernment also affects how men interpret social narratives. Broad generalizations lose power. Emotional appeals lose urgency. Men listen, but they do not automatically comply. They compare words to behavior. When the two do not align, they disengage quietly. This is not rebellion, it is calibration. As more men calibrate in this way, you see a gradual redefinition of social value. Value shifts from visibility to reliability, from popularity to competence, from performance to consistency. These values do not generate viral content, but they generate stability. Men who adopt them are less reactive and more grounded. Grounded men do not argue constantly because they are not trying to convince others of their worth. They know what they contribute to their own lives. This internal validation reduces the need for external conflict. It also reduces susceptibility to shame based incentives. Shame requires a shared value system to function. When men exit that system, shame loses leverage. This is one of the reasons attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame presumes dependency on approval. Independence dissolves that dependency. Once approval is no longer the currency, shame becomes noise. Men tune it out not out of defiance, but because it no longer applies. Another overlooked aspect of this transition is how it affects men's sense of time horizon. When men stop planning their lives around traditional milestones imposed from outside, they adopt more flexible timelines. Progress becomes incremental rather than milestone driven. This reduces anxiety and increases adaptability. Life becomes less about racing toward expectations and more about maintaining balance. This balance is often mistaken for stagnation by outside observers. But balance is not stagnation, it is sustainability. Men who balance effort with rest, ambition with contentment, and engagement with withdrawal are more likely to endure long term challenges. They are less prone to burnout and resentment. Burnout played a significant role in accelerating this shift. Many men reached a point where constant effort yielded diminishing returns. The realization that rest and withdrawal improved outcomes was transformative. Once a person learns that doing less can result in more stability, it fundamentally alters behavior. This is why attempts to frame withdrawal as laziness miss the mark. The men who step back are often disciplined, organized, and self directed. They did not stop working. They stopped working for systems that did not reciprocate. Their effort did not disappear, it was redirected. Redirection also changed how men approach conflict. Rather than in engaging in endless debates, many simply remove themselves. This is not conflict avoidance, it is conflict resolution through distance. Distance eliminates escalation, it preserves energy, it protects focus. Over time, it becomes the default response. Distance also clarifies priorities. When men step back, they see which relationships persist without constant maintenance. Those that do are often mutual. Those that do not reveal their dependency on imbalance. This clarity further reinforces selective engagement. As selective engagement spreads, social expectations begin to lag behind reality. Expectations assume availability. Reality delivers absence. This mismatch creates tension, but tension alone does not restore participation. Only alignment does. Alignment requires change, not persuasion. This brings us to the concept of reversibility. Many cultural shifts are reversible because they are driven by fashion or emotion. This one is not. It is driven by incentives and outcomes. Incentive driven behavior does not reverse without incentive change. And incentive change requires structural adjustment, not rhetorical adjustment. Structural adjustment is slow and uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging past mistakes, accepting responsibility, and demonstrating consistency over time. It cannot be rushed, it cannot be forced, it cannot be faked. This is why so many quick fixes fail. They address symptoms rather than causes. Men understand this intuitively. They have lived the consequences of surface level change. They are skeptical of declarations without evidence. They require proof through action. Until that proof exists, disengagement remains rational. Another dimension often ignored is how the shift affects men's sense of identity. Identity, once tied to roles, is now tied to principles. Instead of defining themselves by what they provide to others, men are defining themselves by how they live. Integrity, autonomy, and calm become identity anchors. These anchors are internally generated and therefore resilient. Resilient identities do not collapse under criticism. They do not seek validation from unstable sources. This makes men less reactive and more self contained. Self containment is often misread as coldness, but it is closer to self sufficiency. Self sufficiency changes relationship dynamics fundamentally. Relationships become optional rather than necessary. Optional relationships must offer value to persist. Value is not limited to material benefit, it includes respect, consistency, and peace. When these are present, engagement is possible. When they are absent, disengagement follows naturally. This is not a threat, it is a boundary. Boundaries do not punish, they protect. Men who have learned to set boundaries are not trying to control others, they are controlling their own exposure. As this pattern continues, society faces a choice: adapt to the reality of optional participation, or continue insisting on assumptions that no longer hold. Adaptation requires humility. It requires listening without defensiveness. It requires recognizing that silence can be feedback, not apathy. Ignoring that feedback does not make it disappear, it amplifies it. Every attempt to pressure without reform pushes more men toward withdrawal. This is not because men are fragile, but because they are rational. Rational people optimize for outcomes. When outcomes improve through disengagement, disengagement becomes the strategy. Changing that strategy requires changing outcomes. There is no shortcut around this. As we move forward, the most important question is not who is right or wrong, it is what works. What produces stability? What sustains cooperation? What aligns effort with reward? Until those questions are answered honestly, behavior will not change. Realignment, if it is ever going to happen, cannot begin with demands or expectations. It has to begin with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is not an apology tour or a public performance. It is a quiet recognition that outcomes did not match intentions and that trust eroded as a result. Men do not require perfection. They require consistency. And and consistency is measured over time, not announced in moments of crisis. This is one of the hardest truths for modern systems to accept because it requires patience without guarantees. One of the reasons realignment feels so difficult is because it requires relinquishing control. Control thrives on predictability, and predictability requires participation. When participation becomes optional, control weakens. This is uncomfortable for any structure that relied on assumed compliance. But discomfort does not mean impossibility. It means adaptation is required. Men who have stepped away are not hostile to change. They are indifferent to promises. This indifference is not arrogance. It is a defense mechanism formed through repetition. When words repeatedly failed to align with experience, trust shifted from language to observation. Observation is slower, but it is more reliable. It does not rush, it watches. Watching creates distance, and distance creates perspective. From that perspective, many men realized that much of the pressure they felt was artificial. It came from expectations that no longer served mutual benefit. Once those expectations were removed, the pressure disappeared. This reinforced the value of disengagement. Disengagement also revealed how much of social tension is sustained by constant interaction. When interaction decreases, tension dissipates. This is not avoidance, it is de escalation. De escalation is often the healthiest response to chronic conflict, yet it is rarely encouraged because it does not generate immediate resolution or visible action. It generates quiet stability. Quiet stability is difficult to market. It does not create spectacle, it does not trend, but it works. Men who embraced it found that their lives became easier to manage, fewer arguments, fewer misunderstandings, fewer obligations they did not choose. This simplicity became addictive in the best possible way. As simplicity increased, so did clarity. Men became clearer about what they wanted and what they were willing to tolerate. This clarity reduced indecision and regret. Decisions were made quickly and without drama. Engagement was intentional. Withdrawal was decisive. This decisiveness eliminated much of the emotional turbulence that had previously dominated their lives. Another consequence of clarity was improved self respect. Self respect grows when actions align with values. Men who stopped compromising their values for acceptance found that their self image stabilized. They were no longer negotiating with themselves internally. That internal alignment created confidence that did not require reinforcement. Confidence built this way does not seek confrontation. It does not need to prove anything. It is quiet and firm. This is why men who have reached this stage rarely engage in debates about their choices. Debate implies uncertainty. They are not uncertain. They are settled. This settlement is often misinterpreted as disengagement from society entirely. In reality, it is selective engagement. Men still participate where participation makes sense. Work that is meaningful, friendships that are reciprocal, activities that produce tangible satisfaction. What they avoid are environments that demand constant performance without offering stability. This selectivity has ripple effects. As men become more selective, standards rise. Not standards imposed on others, but standards applied internally. Time must be worth spending, energy must be worth investing, risk must be proportional to reward. These internal standards quietly shape behavior. One of the most challenging aspects of this shift for observers is that it does not announce itself. There is no manifesto, no leader, no coordinated movement. There are only individual decisions that happen to align. This makes the phenomenon difficult to counter because it cannot be addressed through traditional messaging or negotiation. There is no one to persuade. Attempts to address it through blame or ridicule often backfire. Ridicule signals misunderstanding. It confirms that the observer has not grasped the underlying incentives. Men who feel misunderstood are not motivated to explain themselves, they simply continue doing what works. What truly unsettles many systems is that men are demonstrating that fulfillment does not require constant validation or approval. This challenges deeply held assumptions about motivation. If people can be content without external affirmation, many forms of influence lose effectiveness. Influence shifts from persuasion to demonstration. People watch what works and replicate it. This is how behaviors spread quietly, not through argument, but through example. Men who see other men thriving through simplicity and self direction take note. They adjust accordingly. This observational learning is especially powerful among younger men. They are not burdened by decades of expectation. They are flexible. When they see that disengagement produces calm and focus, they incorporate that lesson early. This creates a generational reinforcement loop that strengthens the trend. The implications of this are far reaching. Societies are built on participation. When participation becomes conditional, structures must evolve. This evolution cannot be forced. It must be earned. Earned through fairness, transparency, and respect for boundaries. Boundaries are a central theme here. Men learned that boundaries are not punishments. They are filters. They determine what enters and what does not. Without boundaries, everything enters. With boundaries, only what aligns enters. This selective permeability is essential for long-term stability. Boundaries also reduce resentment. When men stop saying yes out of obligation, they stop resenting the obligations they accepted. This improves internal well-being and external interactions. Resentment is corrosive. Boundaries prevent its buildup. Another overlooked benefit of this shift is improved adaptability. Men who are not locked into rigid roles can adjust quickly to changing conditions. Economic shifts, technological changes, and social transitions are easier to navigate when identity is flexible. Flexibility is a form of resilience. Resilience built through flexibility is quieter than resilience built through endurance. It does not involve constant struggle. It involves adjustment. Adjustment preserves energy. Preserved energy extends endurance naturally, and this approach to life contrasts sharply with narratives that glorify constant striving. Men are learning that constant striving without security leads to burnout. Sustainable progress requires rest, reflection, and selective effort. This realization fundamentally alters life strategy. As life strategy changes, so does the definition of success. Success becomes less about accumulation and more about balance, less about recognition and more about autonomy, less about intensity and more about longevity. These metrics do not align with traditional markers, but they produce stability. Stability is undervalued until it is lost. Men who experienced prolonged instability understand its cost. Once stability is regained, they guard it carefully. This guarding is not fear, it is wisdom gained through experience. This wisdom is not easily communicated because it is experiential. Men did not arrive here through theory, they arrived through trial, error, and reflection. That makes their conclusions durable. They are not easily swayed by counter arguments that ignore lived experience. As more men adopt this approach, cultural conversations lag behind behavior. Conversations remain heated while behavior remains calm. This disconnect creates confusion. People argue about motivations while men quietly live differently. Eventually, behavior reshapes norms. Norms change, not through debate, but through repetition. When enough people behave differently, expectations adjust. This adjustment is slow, but it is inevitable. The question then becomes whether systems will adapt voluntarily or resist until adaptation is forced by circumstance. Resistance prolongs tension. Adaptation reduces it. But adaptation requires letting go of assumptions that no longer hold. One such assumption is that participation is automatic. It is not. Participation is a choice. Choices are influenced by incentives. When incentives are misaligned, participation declines. This is not a moral judgment, it is a functional observation. Another assumption is that disengagement is a failure. For many men, disengagement was a correction. It corrected imbalance, it restored agency, it improved outcomes. Labeling it a failure does not change those results. The final assumption is that silence indicates confusion or distress. Often, silence indicates resolution. Men who are resolved do not argue, they act. Their actions speak quietly but clearly. As the shift settles in, one of the most profound changes is how men now relate to the idea of community. Community used to be defined by proximity, obligation, or shared identity imposed from the outside. Increasingly, Men are redefining it as alignment of values, behavior, and expectations. This means communities are becoming smaller, quieter, and more intentional. Instead of broad social circles filled with friction, men are choosing narrower spaces where mutual respect is the baseline rather than the exception. This evolution towards smaller, intentional communities is not a rejection of connection, it is a refinement of it. Men are no longer interested in being everywhere, they are interested in being where it makes sense, where effort is reciprocated, where communication is straightforward, where boundaries are understood rather than tested. These environments are rare, but when found, they are deeply stabilizing. The decline of large performative social spaces is not accidental. Performative environments reward appearance over substance. Men who have learned the cost of performance are unwilling to pay it again. Performance requires constant vigilance. Substance requires consistency. Consistency is sustainable. Performance is exhausting. This realization changes where men choose to spend their time. Time allocation becomes strategic rather than reactive. Men are planning their weeks and months around energy management rather than obligation fulfillment. This shift improves long term productivity without increasing stress. Work becomes something to complete efficiently rather than something to endure endlessly. Leisure becomes restorative rather than compensatory. Life begins to feel balanced rather than burdensome. Balance, however, is often misunderstood as disengagement by those who are still caught in cycles of overextension. When someone is accustomed to chaos, calm can look like absence. But absence from chaos is not absence from life, it is presence in one's own life. Men who have achieved this balance are not missing out, they are opting in selectively. This selectivity extends to information consumption as well. Men are increasingly filtering what they allow into their mental space. Constant exposure to outrage, fear, and manufactured urgency is recognized as destabilizing. Reducing this exposure improves focus and emotional regulation. Men are choosing depth over volume, insight over noise. This mental diet reinforces calm and clarity. As clarity improves, men become less reactive to provocation. Provocation relies on emotional hooks. When those hooks no longer catch, provocation loses power. This is why attempts to shame, alarm, or provoke men into re engagement often fail. The emotional leverage is gone. Calm is not easily disturbed once established. Another notable outcome of this calm is improved decision making. Decisions made from a place of stability are more measured and less impulsive. Men are less likely to rush into commitments. They evaluate longer term implications. This caution is not fear based, it is experience based. They have learned the cost of rushed decisions. This experience driven caution is especially evident in how men approach long term commitments. Commitments are no longer entered into because they are expected. They are entered into only when they align clearly with personal values and capacity. This reduces regret and increases follow through. Fewer commitments are made, but those that are made are taken seriously. As commitment becomes more intentional, its meaning changes. Commitment is no longer about endurance at all cost. It is about sustained alignment. When alignment disappears, men are more willing to reassess rather than endure indefinitely. This flexibility prevents long-term resentment and burnout. Burnout avoidance is a recurring theme because burnout was a common outcome of previous expectations. Men were taught to push through discomfort, to sacrifice indefinitely, and to delay personal needs. This strategy works temporarily, but it is unsustainable. Men who reach burnout learned this lesson firsthand. Those who observed burnout in others learned it indirectly. Either way, the conclusion was the same. Sustainability matters. Sustainability reframes strength. Strength is no longer defined by how much pressure one can absorb. It is defined by how well one can maintain stability over time. This form of strength values pacing, recovery, and adaptability. It is quieter, but it lasts longer. As this definition of strength spreads, it influences behavior across domains. Physical training becomes more balanced. Work habits become more efficient. Relationships become more selective. Life becomes less about proving capacity and more about preserving it. This shift reduces injury, exhaustion, and regret. One of the most significant implications of this trend is how it affects long term planning. Men who are not locked into rigid scripts can adapt their plans as circumstances change. They are less likely to feel trapped by past decisions. This adaptability reduces anxiety about the future. Uncertainty becomes manageable rather than overwhelming. And this does not mean men have abandoned ambition, it means ambition has been refined. Ambition is directed toward goals that enhance autonomy and stability rather than external validation. Financial independence, skill development, and personal mastery become central objectives. These goals compound over time and are less vulnerable to external disruption. Compounding progress is attractive because it rewards patience. Men who invest in skills, health, and savings see gradual improvement. This reinforces long term thinking. Short term gratification loses appeal when long term stability is visible. This shift further distances men from environments that encourage impulsive behavior. As impulsivity decreases, so does conflict. Many conflicts arise from impulsive reactions and misaligned expectations. When men slow down, observe, and respond deliberately, conflict frequency drops. This improves quality of life significantly. Quality of life improvements reinforce the choice to disengage from high conflict environments. This creates a feedback loop. Less conflict leads to more calm. More calm leads to clearer thinking. Clearer thinking leads to better decisions. Better decisions lead to improved outcomes. Improved outcomes reinforce the original choice. This feedback loop is powerful because it is self sustaining. It does not require external validation. It does not depend on persuasion. It operates quietly, consistently, and effectively. Breaking such a loop would require introducing a clearly superior alternative. So far, that alternative has not appeared. As we consider the broader societal impact, it becomes clear that this shift challenges traditional models of cohesion. Cohesion based on obligation struggles when obligation loses legitimacy. New forms of cohesion must be based on choice and mutual benefit. This transition is uncomfortable but necessary. Choice based cohesion is inherently more fragile, but also more honest. It requires ongoing alignment. It cannot rely on inertia. This means relationships and communities must offer real value to persist. This raises standards across the board. Raising standards is often resisted because it exposes weaknesses, but resistance does not prevent change, it delays adaptation. Delay increases cost. Men who have already adapted are insulated from this cost. They are not waiting for systems to catch up. This insulation is another reason the shift feels irreversible. Men who have built stable, low dependency lives have little incentive to re enter unstable arrangements. The risk to reward ratio is unfavorable. Without clear improvement, status quo disengagement remains optimal. Another important consideration is how this shift affects emotional expression. Men are not suppressing emotion, they are contextualizing it. Emotion is expressed where it is safe and constructive. Where it is not, it is managed privately. This selective expression improves emotional outcomes rather than diminishing them. Private emotional processing is often more effective than public disclosure in unstable environments. Men who have learned this are less vulnerable to emotional exploitation. This further reinforces disengagement from environments that misuse vulnerability. As men become more emotionally self sufficient, their tolerance for emotional volatility decreases. This is not intolerance of emotion itself, it is intolerance of unmanaged emotion imposed on others. Calm becomes a non negotiable baseline. This baseline changes expectations. Interactions are evaluated quickly. If an environment introduces unnecessary stress, men disengage without argument. This decisiveness prevents escalation and preserves energy. Energy preservation becomes a guiding principle. Men recognize that energy is finite and replenishes slowly under stress. Protecting energy becomes synonymous with protecting well being. This awareness informs daily choices. Daily choices accumulate. Over months and years, these choices reshape lives. Lives shaped by intentional choices are resilient. They do not collapse under pressure, they adjust. Adjustment is the theme that runs through all of this. Men are not resisting change, they are changing proactively. They are adjusting to conditions rather than waiting for conditions to improve. This proactive adjustment gives them an advantage. As this advantage becomes more visible, it influences others. Behavior spreads through observation. Calm is contagious when it is credible. Men who demonstrate calm through consistent behavior attract attention quietly. Others ask questions privately. Lessons spread. This is how cultural change actually happens, not through declarations, but through imitation, not through argument, but through example. Men walking away are not trying to lead. They are simply living differently. That difference is noticeable. As this shift continues forward, it becomes clear that what we are witnessing is not a phase, not a backlash, and not a momentary retreat. It is a long term behavioral correction driven by lived experience rather than ideology. Men did not arrive here because someone convinced them to leave. They arrived here because staying no longer made sense. Once that realization settles in, it does not easily reverse. People rarely return to situations that consistently harm them once they have found a viable alternative. The alternative men found was not escape, but structure. A structure built around predictability, autonomy, and calm. These three elements form the foundation of stability. Predictability reduces anxiety. Autonomy restores agency. Calm preserves energy. Together, they create a life that feels manageable rather than adversarial. Men who have built this structure are not interested in trading it away for uncertainty, even if uncertainty is framed as opportunity or growth. Growth itself has been redefined. Growth is no longer measured by how much pressure one can endure or how many expectations one can satisfy. Growth is measured by internal alignment, by whether effort produces progress rather than exhaustion, by whether commitments enhance life rather than complicate it. This definition of growth produces quieter lives, but stronger ones. Quiet strength is often invisible to systems that rely on noise for feedback. Loud dissatisfaction is easy to respond to. Quiet withdrawal is not. There is no clear demand to meet, no protest to negotiate with, no single issue to address. There is only absence. Absence forces reflection, but only if one is willing to acknowledge it. Acknowledgement is where many responses stall. It is easier to argue motives than to examine outcomes. It is easier to assign blame than to reassess incentives. But incentives shape behavior far more reliably than narratives ever could. Men followed incentives. When incentives changed, behavior followed. This is not emotional, it is mechanical. As more men structure their lives around low dependency and self sufficiency, traditional leverage points weaken. Social pressure loses effectiveness. Moral framing loses urgency. Emotional appeals lose traction. What remains is reality. Reality either offers value or it does not. Men respond accordingly. This reality based approach explains why reconciliation efforts feel ineffective when they focus on tone rather than substance. Tone can soften perception, but it cannot override experience. Experience accumulates, it leaves an imprint. Men who have experienced prolonged imbalance do not forget it because someone speaks kindly. They adjust expectations permanently. Permanent expectation shifts alter future behavior, even if conditions improve slightly. Improvement must be sustained and consistent to rebuild trust. Temporary improvement does not move the needle. Men are watching patterns over time, not moments. Time is the ultimate test of sincerity. It reveals whether change is real or reactive. Men who have stepped away understand this intuitively. They are not in a hurry. They have nothing to gain by rushing back into uncertainty. Patience is on their side. Patience also exposes another uncomfortable truth. Many men discovered that life moves forward just fine without constant social validation. Days pass, work gets done, health improves, finances stabilize, interests deepen, purpose becomes personal rather than prescribed. This discovery dismantles the fear that disengagement leads to emptiness. It does not. It leads to ownership. Ownership of one's life changes everything. Decisions feel grounded, consequences feel manageable. Responsibility becomes internal rather than imposed. This internalization of responsibility is one of the most mature outcomes of this shift. Men are not avoiding responsibility, they are reclaiming it. Reclaimed responsibility does not look like sacrifice for others without limit. It looks like stewardship of self, stewardship of energy, stewardship of time. These forms of responsibility are quiet but powerful. They create lives that endure stress without collapsing. As endurance improves, dependency decreases. Men who are not dependent are not easily coerced. They cannot be pressured into arrangements that do not benefit them. This independence is often misread as selfishness, but it is closer to self respect. Self respect requires boundaries. Boundaries require clarity. Clarity requires distance from chaos. This is the chain many men followed, even if they never articulated it explicitly. Once established, this chain holds. This is why the idea of men returning en masse to old patterns is unrealistic. Those patterns relied upon assumptions that no longer exist. Assumptions of obligation, assumptions of tolerance, assumptions of unlimited endurance. Those assumptions have been tested and found wanting. Moving forward, society will not collapse because men walked away. It will change. Change is not inherently negative, but it does require adaptation. Adaptation requires honesty about what no longer works. What no longer works is expectation without reciprocity, obligation without appreciation, risk without protection, ambiguity without accountability. These conditions eroded trust. Trust does not regenerate spontaneously. What could work is alignment, clear expectations, mutual respect, predictable boundaries, shared responsibility. These conditions are not radical, they are foundational, but they must be demonstrated constantly, not declared. Until then, men will continue building lives that function independently of unstable systems. They will continue choosing peace over performance, stability over spectacle, substance over approval. This choice is not ideological, it is practical. As economic pressure, social fragmentation, and uncertainty increase, the advantages of this approach become more obvious. Low overhead lives are resilient. Self directed routines are adaptable. Minimal dependency reduces vulnerability. Men who embrace these principles early are not scrambling now. They are steady. Steadiness is not exciting, but it is powerful. It allows long term thinking, it allows recovery, it allows focus. In a world increasingly defined by volatility, steadiness becomes a competitive advantage. This advantage is not hoarded, it is visible. Others notice. Quietly, they adjust their own behavior. The shift spreads without announcement, without leadership, without slogans. It spreads because it works. This is why attempts to shame or pressure men back into old roles will continue to fail. Those roles no longer align with outcomes. Men are not rejecting society, they are rejecting arrangements that undermine well being. There is an important distinction there. Men have not lost the ability to cooperate, they have lost the willingness to cooperate blindly. Cooperation now requires clarity and fairness. Without those, disengagement remains rational. This is not the end of connection, it is the end of automatic participation. That distinction matters. Connection based on choice is stronger than connection based on obligation. It lasts longer because it is honest. Honesty is the thread that runs through this entire shift. Honest assessment of outcomes, honest boundaries, honest prioritization. Men are no longer pretending that certain arrangements work when they do not. Pretending was exhausting. Honesty is liberating. Liberation does not look dramatic. It looks like quiet mornings, focused work, controlled spending, rest without guilt. It looks like men discovering that contentment does not require permission. As this video comes to a close, it is important to understand that none of this is a call to anger, resentment, or hostility. It is an explanation of a pattern that has already formed, a pattern rooted in observation and reinforced by results. Men did not leave to make a statement. They left because they learned. They learned that peace is not something granted by others. It is something built through choices. Once built, it is fiercely protected. So now the question is not whether men will come back. The question is whether conditions will change enough to make coming back worthwhile. Until then, men will continue forward, quietly, steadily, without looking back. If you have listened to this entire discussion, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with it? Have you seen the same patterns in your own life or in the lives of men around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because real understanding comes from shared experience, not slogans. And with that said, like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like the video, share the video, and just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.